Welcome to the first regional focus in the Real Business of Wine second series. And this is one that I've really wanted to do since the beginning, which is on China. And why China? Because I've actually been going to China since the early 80s. And I've seen wine evolve there from being not much Chinese white wine, and whether it really was Chinese or not, we'll hear more about, a few bottles of Bordeaux, to the explosion of interest of wine in China, certainly in the 90s, late 90s, heading into the beginning of this century. And as Chinese wine has grown in production, there's been this idea that China is the answer to everyone's problems. If we can't sell wine anywhere else, we're going to sell it to China. So we've got two people here who I'm delighted to have, who have insight into what's happening in China. We have Lin Liu, Master of Wine, one of the first two Chinese Masters of Wine, based now in Cahors in France, where she and her husband make great red wine, but also keeping a very close watch on China in various ways, and has some projects there, I believe, looking forward to what's going to happen in China. And Marcus Ford, whom I've also known for a very long time. Marcus, I first knew of when he was involved in a restaurant called M on the Bund, which was in the days where the Bund, that wonderful long road overlooking the river in the middle of Shanghai, was a pretty moribund place. An Australian lady called Michelle Gonu took over the roof of an old bank and started a restaurant, and Marcus was there to run that. We'll hear more about that, and followed the whole evolution of wine in Shanghai and China through restaurants, through distribution, through Summergate, which grew to be the most important distributor in many ways, and now is heading up WOSA Wines of South Africa in China. So we're going to look at China in various ways, both in terms of internal production, consumption, and what it's importing, and looking very much, because this is what we do, into the future. Where do we think China is going as a wine industry and as a wine market over the next 5 to 10 years? So, Lin, talk us through what you've seen actually in your wine career, and as you see the picture today and into the future.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. So China is certainly quite big in terms of the size and the population of the country. And on top of this, it has been quite important already in relation to its market importance for wine. We have quite substantial numbers for consumption, for production and itself, and also importation. So it does show its importance already. But the thing about China is the speed of development has been so fast. So in the past 10, 20 years, there were lots of things have been changed already. So I think that I would like to highlight a few a few angles to think about China when we talk about this this in relation to the future. First of all, the scale of the logistics is in a very different parameter, because we're talking about delivery within the city on the same day and delivery to another city the next day, which is very normal in China. And this is something we barely could imagine in France, particularly. And talking about e-commerce, it's also very different. So somehow it's also related to social media platform, which is highly related as well. For instance, the WeChat is somehow a part of the function is similar to WhatsApp, but it does have a lot more functions than WhatsApp. So in China, if you like, you don't need to bring any credit cards with you. No cash, you can just get by with WeChat within the country. So that's something very different. So with this all in the context, I think we should always bear in mind that there will be different speed of development as well, of course. So when you're talking about Shanghai, it would be the first tier, one of the first tier cities, and you have all kinds of trends really in line with all the global trends. So natural wine, orange wine, it's quite trendy in Shanghai as well. You don't really feel a huge difference, but in other cities, third tier, fourth tier, maybe even fifth tier cities, you're probably seeing what was happening before in China 10 or 20 years ago. So I think one question to consider is which part of China you want to get into. This is the base of lots of discussions. And talking about speed, I can probably give you an example, 2 examples. Back in 2009, the owner of DRC tried to organize a private tasting in Shanghai, and he barely could recruit enough seats, enough attendees, even it was a free tasting. Today it sounds a bit ridiculous, just considering how much impact Burgundy wines in Chinese market and Chinese investors in this Burgundy segment. But back then it was this kind of situation. And just another example is just days ago, I'm preparing some students in China for the MW exam, and some students, not just one, actually pinpoint Grosvenor in their blind tasting. So that's how different things could evolve, and not just 11 years we're talking about.
So that's happening at a very high level of, we're talking in Shanghai, for example, we're talking about people who've got involved with wine. If we come down the scale in terms of middle class Chinese families, households, who are have not necessarily been involved with wine in a second or third tier city, how is wine really fitting into their lives? Is it fitting into their lives yet? And if so, how is it doing so?
I think it's getting more and more, still like a trendy thing. So China, it is a culture by its own existed in China we say 5,000 years of civilization. So it does have this very profound basis for that. But at the same time, it's also a culture really appreciating and welcoming foreign cultures as well, if you like. So wine has been representing a lifestyle. So even in third tier, fourth tier cities, people still regard the wines as represent a symbol of lifestyle, even though they don't necessarily really appreciate it as a taste. But the idea of having a bottle of wine is very posh.
Now, one of the things that also struck me in the conversations I've had in China over the years is this link between red wine in particular and health. In a country where there's a very clear concept of food and drink being associated with health in various ways. And people have said to me, well, actually, I drink red wine. I don't like it very much, but I drink it for my skin. I drink it for my heart. And there are stories that I get of people drinking, usually young women, and again, you may correct me on this, drinking 1 glass of wine every evening before they go to bed, because they've been told that's a good thing to do. And actually they're taking maybe a week or 10 days to get through 1 bottle of wine, which is probably not tasting great by the time they get to the end of it, but they're treating it as medicine.
Yeah, and I have many friends not from the wine circle actually doing this. And there are some also putting garlic inside wine, because there was some recipe talking about the health benefits, putting garlic in the wine. And I have never tasted it and would be interested to try, but this is something quite special here.
But there's a great leap between drinking something that may not have been very good in the first place, not very good red wine, possibly with a Bordeaux label or whatever the label was, with or without the garlic, and after a few days or not, compared to now people going into cafes, wine bars, whatever, and getting glasses of Prosecco, Pinot Grigio, Rosé, wines that actually they're enjoying drinking. But that's a big leap, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's related to also what wine had been imported in China as well in the past. So it's like it's coming on both hands. So the more the importers are making efforts to bring more decent wines, and there are also more development in the wine education segment, and all sorts of things are happening. So it does change a lot of the acceptance of wine in the genuine manner. So I was tasting with some non-wine friends when I was back home, and they really appreciate certain wines. And they were like, oh, wine can be really good. It's not just, you know, I force myself to drink for health reasons. And yeah.
And the whole thing of adding Sprite or Coke to wine that I've heard of, I think I've seen it once. It happens, I think, in the KTV, the karaoke clubs, perhaps, but it's not something that you actually do see Chinese people doing in restaurants, is it now?
No, personally, I haven't really seen this. I think it's really KTV thing. And at the time, it was not just the wine. They also added green tea to spirits with whiskey most of the time. So it was very KTV-alike kind of scene. But at the same time, I also think I have my sort of explanation about this is I think it's kind of equivalent to the function of Wine Zinfandel in California, which is basically somewhat kind of invention to recruit new drinkers. And the difference is here, okay, some Chinese invented itself, and just to help people to get through easily, and I think with this kind of sweetness does help to appreciate the wines.
I have to say that I was in China with some friends, Chinese friends, and we tried a bottle, I can't remember which vintage it was, of Mouton Cadet with Sprite and Mouton Cadet without Sprite, and it was certainly a far nicer drink with Sprite than it was without. That's me talking. My Chinese friends agree. There was a lot of not very good red Bordeaux that I could entirely understand people not liking.
Yeah, and I think we're talking about probably a lot for a long period. The Bordeaux wines imported to China, it's export 1.4 euros. You know, then that's probably would not be the kind of wine can be easily drank. So
yeah,
I think,
and the Mouton Cadet would have been at the higher end than that. So I guess indeed. Thank you. And we have another friend of long standing, as far as I'm concerned, Suzanne Mustacich, who I've known as a journalist working in various parts, but now with the Wine Spectator, but also writer of the book on the relationship between China and France when it came to wine, and indeed the beginnings of the wine industry in China. So I'm delighted to have Suzanne here talking to us from Bordeaux. Suzanne.
Thank you for having me. You know, this is one of my favorite topics. And I think obviously with the pandemic, a lot of things are changing. And even without the pandemic, the Chinese market is so dynamic and fascinating to watch. So I think we've got a lot of interesting things to discuss.
Suzanne, you actually focus very much when you're writing your book on how China really fell in love with wine. With Bordeaux specifically, and generally.
No, go ahead. No, it's such a big topic that it for a book, obviously I had to focus on something very specific. And I really wanted to capture the adventure of creating the wine market in China. So what I found when I did my investigation was that, of course, we've been trying to sell wine to China for a very long time. And through fits and starts because of the Chinese Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, that, you know, those efforts were stymied. But as soon as there was a possibility of having joint ventures in China, the French were trying to get into the market. They were some of the first. You know, the second joint venture was with a cognac producer. So and it was actually to make wine. But what happened was that because of the way Bordeaux wine is sold through negociants, who are always trying to forge foreign markets, China was just always in there was on their radar, even though it wouldn't have been on anybody else's radar at that time, because there was no market for wine. There was no money for wine. People earned less than $200 a year. There was no market for expensive wine, certainly. And they just, the Bordeaux mentality for breaking into a market is, we're going to sell this luxury item. Wherever there's new wealth, where's the possibility of new wealth, they want luxury goods, right? And wine is this very easily understood luxury good. And that's how they market it. So they were in there right away as China was first opening up. Bordeaux was in that market. And as the military, for instance, and the government needed to woo investors, they were told by the Bordeaux negociants and their partners, here's the perfect thing. Here's these wines. We have this classification system. And the top number one, the first grows, are the best. It's really easy. So it was easy in terms of showing honor and respect to a guest or to a potential business partner. And there was also the expat community who enjoyed these wines. So there was good for the hotels and restaurants. You also had people in Hong Kong was pivotal, who know that if they wanted to start a wine business, then Bordeaux negociants will talk to anybody. It's not like if you're going to go to, say, a big brand where all the distribution is owned by that brand. You can show up with money in your pocket and go see the negociants, and you might not be able to get 1,000 cases of Lafite from one negociant, but you can get cases here and there. You can start building your portfolio. So for entrepreneurs, Bordeaux was a place to come to source top-end wines, which is what they needed to create the market. And that's what happened. And eventually, as we know, China became wealthy. There was a middle class, an upper middle class. There was a real business culture of entertainment. And then really what was pivotal, and I can't help but think about now with the pandemic, that it won't happen this way, I don't think this time, is with the financial crisis. The 2008 wines were sold on Premier for very low price, especially compared to today. And anyone who bought those wines very quickly turned a profit. And that just attracted speculators. It was just this huge speculative bubble started forming. But in fact, that never would have happened if they had not, for almost 30 years, 25 years, been pushing Bordeaux as a luxury product. Here's this luxury product, this international luxury product. And I think whenever there's new wealth and there's people who are trying to enjoy things their parents couldn't have had in an international, sophisticated lifestyle, wine was the perfect thing. And it just created this, you could say, a perfect storm, this speculative bubble. And then of course it crashed, but it was very important for forming the wine market.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think we're going to come back also to what was happening in production in China, because there was a whole separate. We'll come back to that. But Marcus, through this period, you were working initially. You were in the on-premise in the restaurant business, then in terms of distribution, and obviously Bordeaux was part of that picture for you. How did you see that evolve over the period?
Lots of layers to this. I mean, I think what's really interesting about it is the amount of work that was done by the first growths and Bordeaux in general in the early 2000s, before there was a market. As Suzanne said, they were, first mover advantage. And it was also, I think, an understanding that the potential was enormous. And therefore they weren't sending, sort of export managers. They were sending Christophe Salin, they were sending Frédéric Angeret, they were sending, the heads of the organizations. And I think there's a great lesson to be learned there for, the heavy lifting that's required in China to make an impression with the wealthy and the uber wealthy in the case of, the first growths. So there was a lot of groundwork done about category building in those early days, in the early 2000s. And that, has obviously paid dividends in giving Bordeaux its sort of elevated pitch. And as Suzanne said, it's very simple to understand, first growths are the best and second growths are quite good, and you know that's a very easily repeatable story. I would just go back to what Lynn was saying. I'll never forget that tasting with Aubert de Villene, because it was in 2009 at the Park Hyatt Hotel, and it was a horizontal of the 05s. So I mean, you know, the best of the best with, you know, an icon. And I had been invited some time before, and I turned up an hour early because I was petrified of being late. And I was literally told by the organisers to call around and see if we could fill the seats. Now, Aubert is part of a conference called the Terroir Renaissance here. And there's, you know, hundreds of people queuing up to have selfie pictures taken with him. And that's only 11 years on, and that was probably in the, you know, 9 years after that first tasting. Aubert literally can't, you know, turn up at a wine event without being mobbed. So it's just amazing how fast it's moved.
So Marcus, can I go back to that? Because we've got these two strands, and we've then got the additional strands of Australia and Chile and South Africa that you're representing.
Sure.
How did we get from people coming into M on the Bund and either not drinking wine or drinking Bordeaux? And then I have to raise the question, do you remember people adding Sprite or Pepsi to their first growths? Because this is the story that we always heard. And how do we get from that into the point in which people are now, as Lynn is saying, talking about Gravner or talking about Brunellos and Burgundies that are far more obscure than DRC? How did that evolve?
So let me go back a step. I think in the early 2000s, you've got to remember that your average Chinese consumer's first experience with wine, and particularly red wine, is likely to be at a banquet with a pretty ordinary / pretty undrinkable locally Chinese wine. And certainly in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were maybe 3 or 4 individual labels that were drinkable to a sort of Western wine consumer, and the rest was really, really unpleasant. So that culture of adding Sprite to red wine, or Coke or whatever it was, to my mind was totally logical. The wines are undrinkable, and you know, there's a reason that people drink here in France. There's a reason that people drink sangria in Spain, etc., etc. And the, you know, the phenomenon of the cultural phenomenon of adding a sweet fizzy beverage to something which was basically undrinkable makes total sense. So I've always been in defense of the Chinese consumer when it comes to that cultural habit, if you will, or the historical cultural habit. No, I never saw it happen at M on the Bund. I've seen it happen in karaoke places where people are already drunk and they're showing off with whatever, spending their money and splashing things around, and that's fine. It's their money, and that's how they've, you know, chosen to drink wine in the past for the reasons I've explained. So I think honestly the biggest change, I don't want to sound like a sociologist or whatever, but I'm going to, is the fact that from the sort of mid 2000s to now, the amount of Chinese people who've traveled internationally and who aspire to travel and to, you know, some of the luxuries of a Western European lifestyle is just enormous. I mean, in the early 2000s, I didn't know any Chinese people who'd left Shanghai, basically. Certainly none of my contemporaries had ever left China. Now, you know, the sort of cohort of people in the country between the ages of 25 and 40 who've traveled abroad and who, you know, have been to Australia, been to France, have been to New Zealand, been to the States. And when they go, they want to, you know, to experience the best of those countries and their lifestyles. And food and wine is absolutely critical to that. So I think it's a combination of awareness of the categories, so countries first, but also just the cosmopolitan nature of that cohort of people between the age of 25 and 40 who are, you know, pretty wealthy. who've been able to experience it. And I'm sure that's one of the sort of major pieces of the jigsaw that made the change so quick.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Marcus. Lin, can I come back to you on this? Because one of the things that I find culturally interesting in China, and the way that, having watched some of what happened in wine in Japan back in the 80s, what seems to me is what we've seen in China is exactly what we saw happen in Japan with the embracing of Burgundy, for example, but at a speed that has been 10 times faster. But it seems to me that you've got certainly in Japanese, and I would say in Chinese culture, and I'm being very careful not to bring them together, but this point of gifting being common to both countries, and the fact of giving something of value to someone to show that you think that they're important. You can do that in two ways. One is that it's a financially big offering, but the other is that it's if you like, intellectually, or that it's perceived to have a value. So do we get to a point in China where I've given bottles of Lafite, what do I do beyond that? Well, it's something that is rare and special that maybe not everybody's heard of, like a Brunello, like not even a DRC, but a wine that is actually something that the recipient can say, I've got this, nobody else has got it.
I think for the gifting part, it's a bit difficult to say, because I felt this culture of sending a gift with equivalent value, or the value they wanted to deliver for certain things, is so important than finding something interesting, but maybe not with that kind of value. So the value part you're mentioning about is still more focused on how much it's worth of. But that's a very generic summarize. Overall, Chinese want to be appropriate when they give a gift. It carries certain value in the money value instead of intellectual value, if you like. And that's very different from the Western culture I see. So for if your friend gives you 600 euro worth of something as a gift, next time you want to return at least equivalent to that 600 euros worth. That's quite important. Otherwise, it will be regarded as quite inappropriate in this culture. This also explains why some of the fake products could get quite popular, because you probably buy intentionally, knowing that it's fake products, but it carries the value. So, and it's not drank by them. So somehow, it give a gift, making people think it's actually worth of this much, but it doesn't cost you that much money. So that's also one of the reasons fake product that's quite popular.
Actually, this is off the subject, but it is on the subject, Lin. People give tea as gifts in China a lot. Do you get fake tea in the same way as you get fake wine?
It's quite a new thing, because tea was not really in a luxury commodity for a quite long time, until very recently. So now it's very possible, because there are all kinds of luxury tea brands are actually fake as well, like Jingjunmei, one of the very popular black tea in the past few years. So there are lots of production of this as well. So the simple answer is yes.
I'll come back to that, and we'll come back to Baiju, which we mustn't forget.
Can I jump in?
Marcus, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of culture of gifting is an important thing to understand. And I think it also goes back to a certain degree to the perceived health benefits of red wine, as opposed to, certainly in the early 2000s, mid 2000s even, standard gifts for people like doctors was a bottle of Chinese white spirits, or even very, very expensive cigarettes were a very common gift. And the government actually embraced the idea of wine being a healthier option than than very expensive cigarettes and or white spirits. So, and I think that the kind of the sort of X factor to do with Lafite Bordeaux was that it was being traded or gifted between government officials and their business partners. So it really had a real kudos about it. It wasn't just that it was a fancy gift. It was that this is what the government guys do. When I started in the distribution business, or with the retail business that I used to run, we would sell containers, literally, of branded Bordeaux from one of the major houses, I'm not going to name them, to the PLA, who would come and pick it up from warehouses at the Chinese New Year and Middleton Festival. So it really was. I mean, this isn't the kind of fluffy Lafite was a famous name. This was a serious, government sort of endorsed product in a way, bit like Moutai is and had been forever.
We'll come back to Moutai and the whole Gambé and Baiju culture in a second. Suzanne, I think Marcus has opened the door to the conversation of how, I think uniquely in the world, even compared with places like France, China, since Deng Xiaoping, has had a pro-wine government.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because it really started. It started for two things. When they opened up, they were looking for products that they could produce as well as eventually export. Right? They were open to anything, really. That's what when the joint ventures were first taking place. But the other major concern for the Chinese government as they were opening up was starvation, and it was food supply. And they did not want farmers using grain to make alcohol. They needed grain to feed people. I mean, it was really as basic as that. And here was this product using grapes, and they already had a culture of growing table grapes. And in fact, they were even exporting table grapes at that time. So for them, it was very easy. There were some early Chinese, I guess it would be agronomists or botanists who had gone to explore and learn about viticulture. And they were like, okay, this is something we can do. And we're not going to take alcohol away from the Chinese people. That alcohol is an important part of the culture of festivities. And you're not going to suddenly tell them you can't have alcohol. So what can we give them instead? Well, we already grow table grapes. It's something that we can say now, they had fermented fruit drinks as well. And it kept grain. They needed the grain to feed people. It was really as simple as that. And because of the way the economy works, of course, they were able to marshal resources very, very, very quickly towards their own production. And I remember researching in my book that at the time when China opened up, the illiteracy in Ningxia was well over 90%. There were no higher education schools. They needed to create a whole, I want to say a sector. They had to do everything, the education. It was just the consumers. It was everything. They needed to create jobs. They needed to feed people. And wine grapes answered a lot of those problems. And that's why I think the government got behind it. It was health issues, but it was also about just having enough food to feed people.
Thank you, Suzanne. Now that the elephant in the room that doesn't get enough discussion when anyone talks about wine in China, to me, is Baiju. Marcus, you mentioned Moutai, which is not a name that many people outside China necessarily are familiar with. The size of the Baiju market, Baiju, the white spirit that people drink in China, which goes from a very low price to extraordinary high prices, it dwarfs the wine market, doesn't it? And what's interesting to me is how these two businesses actually these two sectors sit side by side, and in some cases you've got Baiju companies in the wine business. But one of the things that I'd like anybody to pick up on, it's one of the challenges for wine is the much larger margins that the Baiju, the white spirit makers, can achieve, which is actually a challenge for, let's say, a South African or an Australian or a French winery to give the distributor in China, where he might, compared to what he can make when he's selling a white spirit. Marcus, do you want to pick up on that?
I wouldn't necessarily support the case. I mean, I think the question with Baijiu is volume. It's such an enormous market. The volumes are so huge. The prices are so high. And it's traded almost like a commodity, that they're sort of conditioned to that margin structure, the means of distribution. It's a different beast. Conversely, I mean, I think that, with lesser known brands, so if a Baijiu distributor is selling, an Australian or a French wine or a South African wine that no one's ever heard of, they think they can get away with murder in terms of margin. So the sort of Baijiu model, and I think, anybody who's been involved in kind of any of the big international distribution businesses or the importers in China, the ASCs, the Summergates, the EMWs, all those guys, the great elephant in the room was always, when is a big Chinese Baijiu and beer distributor going to get their hands around, or their heads around how to do wine? Because then all of those international companies are going to become irrelevant. And the reality is, it hasn't really happened yet. COFCO's now on its third try of trying to make, third strategy rerun of trying to do imported wines, and it hasn't really happened. So I think there are so many different routes to market, channels to market, variations on how you reach a consumer in China, that I don't actually support the sort of margin argument in that way.
Okay, Lin, and let's talk a little bit about how the Chinese production, how the Chinese industry has evolved. Suzanne talked about how the government supported it, and we're going back really to the 80s, I guess. How have you seen because there are challenges in terms of climate, in terms of cold in the winter and so on. And indeed, what kind of wine have people been making? What did they choose to plant, and why?
Well, to be honest, not very familiar with all the history and all the details about this topic, but I just say what I am aware of. Well, first of all, adding a point to what Marcus has mentioned earlier, can I just add one point to
go ahead.
Yeah, I don't really think the Baijiu is actually in the same market segment as wine. So the same point as Marcus, and then mainly because the palate is so different, and they're really facing different consumers. So whoever likes Baijiu doesn't, more than likely, would not be the target market, the potential consumers for wine, and vice versa. So I personally don't really think they're actually replacing one from each other. So that's my point on.
Could I just interrupt there and pick up on that? Because my impression, two things. One is, if you're in China, the one thing you're very aware of is the amount of marketing for Baijiu everywhere, which is that those margins I mentioned earlier permit, which they wouldn't permit for most wines. But the other thing is, young people, as you've just said, are not necessarily wanting to drink Baijiu as much as their parents. Do you want to address those things?
I actually I grew up in a family which is a keen supporter of Baijiu. So my dad actually drinks lots of Baijiu, and I think I try to have a nice relationship with my dad by drinking what he ever is drinking. But I never liked the taste. And but for wine, at the beginning, it's also not very easy for Annie's palate to accept the wine immediately. So it took a bit of time for me to really enjoy it. And one summary of a friend of mine was talking about his whole involvement in the acceptance of wine was accepting acidity and then tannin. And I just thought that's brilliant, because that's exactly what I had been through. And once the Chinese palate are more accepting to the tannins and the acidity, actually, it opened lots of doors to wines. But this said, it's how would you properly put it? But it's just a different profile of taste and the flavors, and no matter how I try it, yeah.
People talk about, it's certainly a personal bugbear of mine, producers come into China and say, my wine is perfect with Chinese food. And I've always had a problem with that in terms of A, the range of Chinese foods, but B, the range of food on a table. How do you see that food and wine matching question in China?
Oh yeah, I think almost all the Chinese in the wine business has been asked by some producers at some point about this question, and it's really a very interesting perspective, a very good example of explaining how culturally we're different. Basically, I think my point of view, Chinese food in the Chinese way of presenting, of eating, don't really go with wine, because we're probably have 2 or 3 sets of dishes. The first set will be cold dishes, and it will involve different kinds. It will have vegetables, it will have meat, have fish, and there will be vinegar, there will be spices, there will be all kinds of different things. And the same as hot dishes. So the second segment, the second part of the banquet would be hot dishes, and there will again be all kinds of food. And then the third is probably just finishing up with dumplings and things like this. That's very traditional way, and usually the table is round and it's quite small, and it could be big, but after all the dishes being put on, it doesn't really have that space for matching 8 different wines with 8 different dishes on the table, for instance. So I think it's a big misconception about matching or trying too much. I think it does have its value in certain circumstances, because there are tailor-made menu to do wine matching and stuff. It's also one segment that's coming up, but it's really not a big trend. It's not a mainstream trend, in my point of view, and it will not change dramatically. I don't think so.
Thank you, Lin. Suzanne, can we go? Marcus.
No, I find it one of the most infuriating things that I hear from Western producers or journalists even trying to tell China how to drink wine. I really find it quite offensive. I think that the biggest challenge in China is matching a wine to an occasion and to a person, and whether that wine's appropriate, delicious in whatever context it may be. And I think the whole food and wine thing is a terrible distraction.
So what I find most interesting about this is we're dealing in the non-Chinese market with so many issues of communication. How do we talk about wine? What language do we use? Is our food and wine pairings even appropriate now? The notion that any of us, whether I'm in Spain, I don't eat Spanish food every day, it is really based on a lot of stereotypes around how we talk and learn and adopt. So here's my question. Marcus, you said earlier that you've got a band that does fall into the elder millennial category, or the younger millennial, 25 to 40, who are spending a lot of money, they're adopting wine. Now we're talking about issues of food and wine pairing and how we communicate appropriately around that. Is this a situation where instead of the West saying, what can we teach China? What we really need to be doing is the West needs to be sitting back and saying, what can we learn from China? And I'll open that up to anyone.
Well, actually, I thought what Marcus said, I agreed wholeheartedly. In fact, when we were talking, I was thinking about one of my first visits to China, and I was with a bunch of winemakers, and I was observing how they were trying to sell their wine in China. And this was in 2009, so around there. And they were meeting with all these young journalists who were trying to understand wine and how they were going to write about it to explain it to their readers. And these were with French winemakers, and they were saying, well, now you need to have this wine with your cheese course, and this wine with your, whatever, your entrecote. I'm like, what are you talking about? You're not going to sell them cheese and entrecote. Let them drink wine however they want to drink it. And it was I found it very pretentious and condescending. Oh no, you must drink it this way. You must serve this wine first and this wine second. And it's like, it's not your job to do that. And it is really condescending. I think one thing we can learn from the Chinese market is that when we go into a market, we want to bring our wine into a market, let that market evolve in an organic way, in a natural way. What was terrific about wine is a product that can adapt to so many cultures, so many situations, so many occasions, and let that happen naturally. Don't sit there and say, oh, you have to drink this wine with this food. The point is it should give pleasure. When I would be asked many, many times, how do we serve a wine? Which wine should we start with? I'm like, start with the one that you really like. Just, do you like it? Does it give you pleasure? Drink some more of it. Our job, I think, is to sell wine that people enjoy, encourage them to uncork it, drink it, and buy another bottle.
I think that if I can just chip in to say that actually anybody who looks at British culture or indeed German culture, these are cultures where wine was not drunk with food. Wine, but by most people, a lot of the time, people drink it as an aperitif, they drink it all sorts of times. And indeed in Spain, you had peasants drinking wine in the vineyards as a drink. They certainly didn't have any food. Suzanne, can I come back to you? Because I'd like to go back to this history, because I think it is interesting. You mentioned Ningxia. We're going from a time where there was just a little bit of white wine being made, as those joint ventures, and brandy companies wanting to distribute cognac. So it made sense for them. How did we get from there to the point at which China, and obviously all the statistics vary in terms of how much wine really is being made in China, but how did we get from there to the point where China is now one of the biggest wine vineyard countries in the world?
Well, again, it obviously comes, a big part of that is the Chinese economic model, that when the government decides to invest in something, they have all the resources, all the land, all the labor they need. And, in Ningxia, they needed to hold down the desert. They needed to push back the desert. They needed to plant a lot of trees, anything they could, bushes, and preferably something that's going to give a crop. Okay, that's really what it came down to. And at the same time that in joint ventures, this is just in the beginning, that there were projects to plant trees and other crops, they decided it was proposed and accepted to plant grapevines, which they already had, again, because of table grapes. So this wasn't a huge leap, but then they had a really hard time selling white wine. They thought, a lot of the first importers actually thought that it was going to be a white wine culture the way America was, the way American consumers started off with sort of a sweeter white wine. But they just couldn't get Chinese consumers, they didn't buy it, they didn't like it. And red wine, again, I think this goes back to Bordeaux pushing red wine, then eventually the idea that it was good for their health. They wanted red wine, and they wanted wine grapes that were the Bordeaux varieties. Is really what it came down to. It didn't have to do with soil type or climate. It was just, let's plant the Bordeaux varieties.
So we have 75% or so of Cabernet Sauvignon now in all sorts of places. And we have places like Shandong, where, again, it's not necessarily the easiest place in the world to make wine. Ningxia is not necessarily the easiest place. No. But climate change is actually also having an effect. Some of the places are looking better now, maybe, than they were 15 years ago.
Yeah, obviously on the coast, where, again, the wine grapes were planted there in the beginning simply because that region of China was open to co-ventures. It was, and it's also historically where the treaty ports were. It's where the first vineyards were planted, at the turn of the century. It was not this century, the century before. It was so, but again, that's about politics. It had anything to do about actually planting wine grapes with the objective of creating fine wine. It had nothing to do with that. And, you know, all the regions in China have issues in terms of producing fine wine, whether it's disease, a lot of disease from the rains during the picking season and rot. You've got to convince the farmers who are being paid by the kilo that they should wait until the grapes are ripe, as opposed to when they're sure to have a crop that they could sell. There's a lot of issues. And of course, in the north, they have to bury the vines in the winter. I have no idea what the climate change is going to bring to China. I have absolutely no, I'm not the person to ask for that. But all of the regions have changes. If it became drier during the ripening season in the coastal areas, that would obviously be a very good thing for that one.
I think, Suzanne, I think one of the other factors that has always been important with respect to winemaking in China is access to water.
Yeah.
And in Shandong, they've got masses of rain, and in Ningxia, they've got access to irrigation from river waters, again, all of which is controlled by the government. So the sort of politics of access to water if you're not in a wet place like Shandong, and access to labour, are very, very politically motivated.
Lin, I think
that's the case.
Lin, you had a comment, I think.
Yeah, I just want to add the comment to one of the reasons they also planted in Ningxia, places like Ningxia, was also to stop the place to be to change to be desert. So one of the reasons to growing lots of vines there was initially to hold the land. So they grow, actually at the time there was also not just Cabernet Sauvignon. I think at the beginning there were lots of indigenous grapes, and that's still a large part of it. And then 15 years later, 20 years later, they found, oh, actually we can do something with these vines. So I think that was one major reason too.
I think the Ningxia story is one that needs to be written in the future, because it really is against all odds. We're going to plant vines to stop the desert. We're going to plant vines to provide employment, and we're going to plant vines to diversify agriculture, when in reality they've had to learn how to grow vines in a place that nowhere in the world would you choose to plant vines. It doesn't make sense, and they've made it work. Extraordinary.
It reminds me of Washington State, actually, in some ways. There are some comparisons between some of the parts there. But Marcus, can I keep the ball with you for a second? Because looking at time, distribution and communication are the two things that to me are different in China. Firstly, there is the power of social media of various kinds, and the evolution of social media, and the fact that people, the idea of social commerce, people actually buying through their social media challenge, be it WeChat, Weibo, whatever. And secondly, how that distribution actually physically happens. Because for an American who's in one part of the country and can't get wine from another part of the country, I think it's very hard to imagine how seamless it is in China.
I think the first thing to understand about the Chinese consumer, the Chinese economy generally, is that, in some industries, in some areas, we started 15, 20 years later than other countries and other economies. And that means that, for example, logistics now, when people open logistics hubs, they've got the most advanced technology on the planet to do these things. They're using AI for automation. They're doing, the distribution centers of the big e-com guys are better than anything else that exists in the world. So you've got these existing robust commercial platforms that allow logistics, for example, to be incredibly simple. So, that logistics infrastructure underpins the ability of e-commerce and social commerce to achieve anything. I think the other thing I think there's two parts to this. I think when you talk about e-commerce in China, it really, for the time being, is two massive platforms. It's Jingdong and the Alibaba networks. And I think that it's incredibly important to understand the cost of being relevant in those platforms. So if you go to the front page of Tmall, or you go to the front page of Jingdong and you search for red wine, the first 4 or 5 pages that you scroll through will be one of two things. There'll be one of the big 5 brands who've really invested in figuring out how to do e-commerce. So Penfolds, Yellowtail, Conchitoro, DBL Lafitte, Castel, maybe I'm missing one, but it's basically the first 5 pages is going to be that. And then the other thing that you're going to see there is private labels, which are marketed the hell out of because they've got enough headspace and margin to be able to play in that space. I was talking to the head of one of the big brands, which I shan't mention, but they were saying that essentially for them to make Tmall or Jingdong work, they needed to essentially develop a new product for that marketplace. And within the sort of margin structure, they needed to have at least 25 to 30% of A&P promotional spend to get that wine anywhere near the sort of front pages of a consumer if they're looking for it. So to think that e-commerce is the answer is just not the case. You have to be strategic about how you think about those channels, because it really is a race to the bottom. I mean, if you look now, 10 years ago, Rawson's Retreat was on the shelves around China for somewhere in the region of 135 to 150 RMB. Now, Rawson's Retreat is typically between 38 and 41 RMB online at any given time. And that's basically being used as a loss leader. So you really need to be strategic about it. Tell you, very interesting, I'm not going to talk about South Africa too much, but there's a very interesting operator in Jingdong at the moment who runs what he calls the South African Wine Pavilion. And they've gone after an incredibly sort of focused and really smart model, which is to say, right, we're going to go after premium South African producers. So we're going to work with the Kiermonts, the Tokaras, the Benguela Cove, a whole bunch of really serious producers. They're going to work directly, so they become the exclusive agent for those wines. And their model is, we're only going to do premiums. So we're only going to do three packs and 6 packs. So the average transaction on their store in Jingdong is $200 US, which is unheard of in wine e-commerce in China. But what they're doing is they're corralling a cohort of people who have begun to become interested in premium South African wine, and they give them a great deal because there's no one else in the chain. So they import directly. Jingdong is their only channel. They have no aspiration to sell to a hotel or a restaurant. They have no aspiration to sell to a supermarket or another wine store. And because of the scale of Jingdong, if they acquire 30,000 customers who are each buying a case of wine a year, they've got a very substantial wine business. So there are strategies that work in e-commerce, but you absolutely need a strategy. I think the other thing that's really interesting, and particularly with COVID, I think, during the period of lockdown and restrictions, people understood that it's very difficult to quickly become a serious player in Jingdong, to become a serious player in Tmall. But it's not that difficult actually to start using your whole sales force or your whole team to be selling on WeChat, because anybody can transact. Everybody's WeChat is linked to their bank account. You're 2 clicks away from a transaction, and the logistics are super easy to facilitate. So I think the guys who are busy in e-commerce already, who know what they're doing, probably have done pretty well during this period. But I think what will have changed is the social commerce aspect.
Can I just continue this just for a second, Marcus, because it does tie in with this, and something that obviously didn't work during the lockdown part of COVID, and it isn't talked about a huge amount. But one of the producers in South Africa, Hein Kokenberg from Leopard's Leap and La Motte, has a phenomenal business selling brands that were created for South Africa through a kind of Tupperware Amway system, where they're being sold, if you like, invisibly. It's not going through the traditional shops or through any kind of shops or any kind of online basis, but they are going through WeChat, I believe, or the WeChat would help to make some of that happen. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know we're running tight on time, but I'd love to hear something about it.
Well, it's a China unicorn story, I have to say. That business was enormous for 2 years. And then the government started to regulate multi-level marketing companies, and that business is no longer there. So, yes, the for
came
a
up
period
and went
of time,
down. But do you think?
No, it got shut down.
Yes.
The whole pyramid. Sorry, politically correct version of pyramid selling is multi-level marketing, I believe now. But yeah, no. So that it fell off a cliff because the government started to regulate that channel. And it became most of those businesses were started up on the basis of healthcare products. In China, a lot of vitamin supplements and things, and there was a health scare involving one of the big companies where a bunch of children got very, very sick about 2 years ago, and the government basically shut down the whole setup for all of those businesses.
Thank you. Lin, in terms of communication, and I'm sorry we haven't got Terry Xu here, because I'd love to have him, but we've talked to him in the past on Real Business of Wine. You have a very different situation in terms of wine communication in China, because although you do have some people who know the Western critics, James Suckling is quite strong in China, Relatively So, Jancis, Wine Spectator, and so on. You also have the local influencers. Lady Penguin leading the pack, I would say. Terry's there and a few others are there. To me, what's interesting in China is that they don't make any pretense of being independent and impartial. There is a financial model that surrounds those influencers that actually rewards them for promoting sales for particular brands. Have you been looking at that?
Yeah, I think it's also related to this market is really new, relatively new. So all the professionals, even if they've been in the wine business for a while, they don't necessarily have the authority to carry the same weight and the credibility as many established markets, those critics in the established markets. So that's first of all very different. And then secondly, it's again a very new market, so you attract people differently, and because you're trying to recruit somebody probably doesn't really have too much know-how about it. So you invent very different new ways to weave in to be suitable for this culture as well. But this said, Lady Penguin has done a great job in terms of the mass market. So she's probably one of I think she probably has the highest number of followers, the absolute numbers in China. But at the same time, I think we should also pay attention to which segment we're talking about. If it's a very preliminary market, how should we project the future? So maybe people like Fengyi Walker, MW, who is very important in wine education. So her absolute followers is not necessarily comparable to them compared to Lady Penguin, but she has played a very important role in terms of the B2B level, wine education to wine professionals, and this all come hand in hand, and it's neglectable that this part of influence is very important. So of course it's not just the Fengyi. There are more and more MWs are based in China, and there are more Chinese MWs or MW candidates, and there's Chinese master sommelier, and so on and so forth. So I think it's related.
Our awards, I mean, you and I both judged at competitions together and so on. Are medals and awards and scores, are they important for younger consumers?
I think it really depends. So the right answer is it really depends. I've been asking also some different importers who has been there for at least the last 10 years, and everybody gave me very different answers. Somebody said totally useless. I'm just selling whoever is confident in me, and we're talking about those have a big, good portfolio of different kinds of wines, and including Bordeaux, Burgundy, and some other interesting wines. But and some are saying this is a very important factor to have awards for people who has no idea about wines. So it does help. So I guess it's just different market segments in China.
Thank you. Now one question, we're quite close to the end, but one question that leads us into is education, which is the mantra we always hear. Everyone says we need more education, more education. And WSET is incredibly strong in China.
Yeah,
and I'm a great fan of WSET in all sorts of ways. We had Ian Harris on a few weeks ago talking about it. Is the WSET, are the courses, the global courses that are being taught all over the world, are they 100% appropriate to the Chinese student of wine because of the cultural differences? Lin?
I feel there are some different aspects. Really has a strong cultural influence from China. Is sometimes, you know, the tasting distributors does mean nothing to the Chinese. Most of the people in China would not have heard of maybe half of those distributors. So this is not really relevant if you want to cut into this market as profound as possible. Others, I think overall it's a really good course. So I don't think there is a competition in the near future to WSET, though it does have lots of this and that issues, and they are also trying to do their best to be more appropriate to be more suitable to the Chinese students.
Thank you, Lin. Suzanne, you did your, so Marcus, jump in. Do you have something to say?
Just on education, I think one of the really interesting trends that we've seen recently, and I was talking to both Feng Yi and Julian Boulard last week actually, they were saying that they're seeing a real uptick in people studying level 3 in English because they ultimately want to go for the Master of Wine. So they're starting to take on WSET level 3 in English so that they're on a pathway to diploma in English and then ultimately on the pathway to MW, which gives you a sense of the ambition of many of the people. And I think it is that hierarchy thing, you know, if the MW or the MS is the ultimate accolade, people want to be on that journey to get there. And I think that's why WSET, warts and all, will still be the most important platform in China.
Thank you. Suzanne, you, I think, are working on another book on China as a follow-up to your first one, am I right?
No, actually, well, no, I've just finished a different book entirely. So no, my writing schedule has changed just a little bit. But I've been asked to, there was a lot of material that didn't go into my book. And I've had different people in China really strongly suggest that I turn that into a book because there was a lot of, you know, I just did a huge amount of historical research, and some of those records aren't necessarily available in China. So I did research in different countries, and so that will be my next China book, I think. But actually, one thing I wanted to say is that we didn't really touch on tourism. And I think that that's actually part of, obviously, education too for consumers. Is one thing, when Chinese people, we saw it as Chinese people started traveling, you know, one of the things they started traveling to were wine regions. And when they come to France or come to Italy, and something that's really, we've really seen that they enjoy that culture, that lifestyle, that culture. And obviously that creates wine drinkers, wine lovers, wine collectors. So it's, you know, it's terrific for the wine trade. But even when I was researching my book, when I talked to people who started really were at the forefront of the Chinese people, the forefront of the wine trade in China, each time they said the same thing to me, is that when they arrived in a wine region, whether it was California or France or Italy, and they arrived and they saw it was just the sheer beauty of it. And they said that, you know, they thought, if I can do a business in this can be my trade, my commerce, I can make money at this. And it's this beautiful thing. And there's this history and this culture and there's this, you know, great food and all of that. I want to do it. You know, they had this vision, you know, 30 years ago that this is what they wanted to bring to China. And that's why we're also seeing, obviously, wine tourism in Ningxia and elsewhere. But I think that there is this desire for that kind of lifestyle. And maybe Lin can tell me if this is true with younger Chinese people. The people I'm talking about would be, you know, in their 50s and 60s now.
Lin?
I definitely have seen a big changes in that, partly because of my situation as I'm based in France. So I get to know lots of these kind of visitors. And they also had a huge interest to know about the culture in very profound way. So usually, typically there will be a trip booked with all the Michelin star restaurants. Stop until they're tired. Oh, actually, we'll want some Chinese noodles instead after a few days. But that's very common. So basically, you book a fancy tour with all the Michelin star restaurants. You go eat there, you dine there, and you go to regions you're familiar with. And I remember I've seen in a Burgundy daily newspaper, I don't remember the name of the newspaper, it was local. They were talking about the amount of Chinese visitors was enormous and had a huge increase. I don't remember the name, the number from my head, but it was really big numbers. So it's up and coming, and almost every wine education institution now are expanding the business for wine tourism. So it's the integrated business.
I think Suzanne's point about the quality of wine tourism in China should not be overlooked, because the sophistication of the chateau, maybe we in the West might laugh at the sort of the Disney character of them, but they are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are learning about wine by getting on a train from Shanghai or Beijing and going to somewhere, or a plane, and actually learning about it in their own country. But they're getting a kind of taste of wine culture.
Yeah, and there's even housing developments, you know, around wine culture centers, sort of thing. So there'd be kind of like a vineyard there. They can have a vacation home there, or that can be their full-time house. I think it's all hand in hand with the growing middle class and the increase in wealth and disposable income, and also their ability, you know, the government allowing people to travel from region to region and out of the country. But, you know, still a lot of Chinese people don't have the means to leave China, or maybe they don't want to. A lot of Americans don't leave America, but they want to explore their own country. And I think these, you know, the wineries have become a destination. It's a family trip. It's a trip that couples take. It's seen as romantic, and all that is a form of education.
And finally, how good? I think we're going to have another session with a group of producers from China in the next few weeks, which should be fascinating. But I'm interested to hear from the three of you, because you're not producing wine in China, but you see what's going on. How good do you think Chinese wine is today? And I'm talking about real Chinese wine rather than wine that we've had in the past with bulk imported wine being blended with it. And how fast do you think it's improving? Do you think in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we are going to be looking at people drinking Chinese wine in the West? Or is Chinese wine being made for China and just using the West for prestige purposes? Marcus?
So, I mean, I've got a long history of tasting Chinese wine. I organized one of the first big blind tastings of wine in China in 2001. And we tasted, I think, 120 wines as a panel. And I think that of those, we got 12 that we thought were commercially acceptable to a Western palate. which we showed to Jancis way back when, so when Jancis was first visiting China. But the 12 that were okay, I think 4 came from Grace, which had just released its first wines in the early 2000s, 2001, somewhere around there. But the others were really undrinkable. I mean, beyond beyond anything you could imagine. You'd smell them, you wouldn't want to put them near your mouth. So yes, there's been a big sort of increase in quality. What there hasn't been is a big volume brand that's making sort of accessible Chinese wines at good price points. I think Grace and Herland Mountain are probably the 2 that make, you know, the best sort of commercially available wines, but they're still not inexpensive. They retail for the equivalent of $20 or so. Ningxia's problem fundamentally, I think, is that they started too expensive, and they're really trying to figure out how to reposition so they've got commercially viable volumes and at decent price points. Some of the best wines are as good as anything made in the world right now. The challenge, I think, is vintage to vintage as well. Ningxia has real vintage variation. There are some great additions of some producers that we all know and love, and there are some pretty ordinary ones as well. So I think there's a lot of challenges to overcome.
Thank you. Wrapping up, any thoughts for the future? Lynn, looking forward.
I think at this moment is actually a difficult time to talk about the future because we're the virus stuff. And we're not sure what's the impact yet. But putting this all aside, I think China is just starting, and I think it's a market deserves lots of attention to really understand the culture, like what have been discussed. Maybe we should change, the Western should change the attitude and the position of how to look at China, maybe try to understand more about Chinese market instead of trying very hard to push the culture here to be implanted there without any adaptation. Otherwise, I see a huge market. I see lots of signs of upcoming big markets.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Great message there. And Suzanne?
Yeah, the same thing. I would like to see us adapt. How can I say, adapt our product, adapt our message. I agree with what we said earlier about the food and wine pairings. Let the Chinese people decide how they're going to drink the wine and how they're going to serve it, and which wines they enjoy, and stop telling them how to drink wine. And I think just commercially, I think it's to be very interesting to see internet sales, to see how within the pandemic, how that changes, and how consumers, we talk a lot about with the pandemic, consumers are changing some of their purchasing choices, even how they purchase, but also what they're purchasing. And I think that's going to be very interesting to watch in China.
Suzanne, thank you very much. I think this has been a great session. Thank you. It's been a different session from some of the ones we've done before. And I'm looking forward to seeing this go up on YouTube within the next 48 hours, I guess. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe.